There it is. Okay. Thank you, Bob, for the opportunity to be here tonight, and thank you all for joining in. I know the Electric Railroaders Association has hosted some fabulous speakers in recent years, so I'm honored to join their company and share my work. I'll talk for just under 90 minutes and then open things up to question and discussion. This is my first ERA meeting, but while drafting the presentation, I discovered that my late grandfather, Richard Delaney, was once among your members. Here's how I know. On February 25th, 2006, he
Dave,
published...
oh, there, okay. Now your slide came up. Okay, go
Great,
ahead.
okay. So here's how I know. On February 25th, 2006, he published this letter in the New York Times, a response to an article about the West Side's High Line, which was then on its way to becoming the cherished ribbon park we know today. In his letter, my grandfather recounts playing stickball in Chelsea, smacking home runs onto what was then the New York Central's right-of-way. He mentions acquiring discounted bags of broken cookies from the Nabisco factory and regrets that the MTA never converted the line to light rail. Toward the end of the letter, my grandfather states that his, quote, last and most rewarding encounter was a walking tour of what remained of the High Line in 1982, sponsored by the Electric Railroaders Association. This seems so fitting. I forever associated my grandfather with the world of trains and electric trains specifically. I remember walking down from his Riverdale apartment to Metro North's Spuyten Duyvil station, perhaps the most beautifully situated commuter depot in the world, and where you would hear the hiss of third rail current long before a string of M3 cars swung around the river bend and clattered into view. I remember my grandfather's visits to Bensalem, the Philadelphia suburb where I was born, and where we would watch trains pass through Croydon along with my Uncle Dwight, who I think is in the audience tonight. I remember SEPTA Silverliners pulsing by, some still bearing the faded logo of their former operators, the Reading and Penn Central. I remember Amtrak's AEM7s, so boxy and Swedish like a Saab or a Transformer, towing their fluted columns of Amfleet coaches. I remember my grandfather relaying the travails of his father-in-law, who worked as an engineer for the Long Island Railroad. And I remember that when it came to talking trains, if I made a too easy distinction between electric motors and diesel locomotives, he would remind me that diesel electric engines ran on current too. They just had the decency to carry about their own fuel. All railroading, I learned, was to some degree electrical. Today, I live far from the wires in Buffalo, where my 9-year-old daughter, Mira, has inherited the family's fascination with trains. It's in her blood. Mira knows which whistles go with freight and which belong to Amtrak. She knows that the arrival of the Toronto-bound Maple Leaf signals the end of her school day. Like me, Mira's happy to pack a lunch, hit the platforms with a sketchbook or notebook. And unlike me, she has a perfect knack for color coordination. Buffalo may be a paradise of trains, but when I moved here in August 2012, I missed the sizzle of catenary, the elegant purr of multiple unit trains as they shunted back and forth through city and suburb, the way the wires bounce at Princeton Junction whenever Acela blasts by. I miss the feeling of being patched into something beyond my home, a literal and figurative circuit. And so I wrote a book about one particular electric train line and the region it serves. The Northeast Corridor is the busiest, fastest, and most important intercity passenger rail line in North America. Corridor trains carry some 800,000 riders each day, a head count greater than the populations of Seattle, Denver, and San Francisco. Trains deliver those people to hundreds of thousands of jobs, including 1/3 of Fortune 100 firms, 263 colleges within 5 miles of a station, and over 30% of civilization's most visited museums. The line links one of the world's most powerful financial centers to its most consequential political capital. Economists estimate that closing the corridor for a single day would sacrifice $100 million worth of lost labor to gridlock. The line enables 17% of the country's population to live on just 1.4% of its land. The corridor is a gift from history and a tool for survival, or as Drexel University President John Fry testified before Congress, it is America's greatest transportation asset. So great is this asset that the word corridor has grown synonymous with its region. People do not simply ride the corridor, but live there too. Once home to tens of thousands of Algonquins, this coastal band between Virginia and Massachusetts became a beachfront for colonial conquest, a test bed for the Industrial Revolution, a fiscal laboratory, and font of global policy, a new order of space that the geographer Gene Gottman called megalopolis. Like Rust Belt, Deep South, Silicon Valley, and Appalachia, corridor has become shorthand for what many think of as the region's defining features. Its brisk pace of life, ethnic and racial diversity, its comparative affluence, and to some minds, its coastal elitism. But as I show in my book, that's barely part of the story. As any passenger can tell you, the corridor draws together many worlds. Young and old, rich and poor, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, English-speaking and Hispanophone among many other languages. The line races through forests and along beaches, past weedy lots and chemical plants, through villages, cities, and marsh. There's more to the corridor than pundits would lead you to believe. Manhattan, yes, but also Saybrook. Washington, sure, but don't forget Aberdeen. Tonight, I'm going to talk about one of the most pivotal developments in corridor history, the line's multi-stage electrification by the New Haven Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and finally Amtrak. This is a story of powerful private corporations and timely state interventions. It's a story of regional identity and industrial capacity that spans the seaboard. It's also a story in pieces. Today's corridor may feel like a cohesive act of infrastructure, at least to riders, but it's really a patchwork of many railroads whose names live on only in archives. The Boston and Providence, the Harlem River and Port Chester, the Camden and Amboy, the Philadelphia and Trenton, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, and the Baltimore and Potomac are just a few of the fallen flags whose rights of way we still use today. The corridor was never a neat and tidy project, a bullet train, TGV, or interstate highway. Rather, the line came together intermittently, even accidentally over time, like a row of bushes hedging together. For centuries, Maryland track gangs, Boston Brahmins, German swamp drainers, Irish baggage smashers, and Mexican braceros had no idea what they were building together. They had no sense that they were writing separate volumes of a shared epic. Some of this variety lives on in the corridor's quiltwork electrical system, which is comprised of different catenary support designs, power generation methods, substations, phase breaks, and the simple fact that one train will receive alternating current on 25 or 60 hertz frequencies at different points in its journey. Such variations are not ideal from an operations perspective, as anyone who's ridden New Jersey Transit in the last month can attest, but they do make for a great story. In writing this story, I follow in the footsteps of studies like William Middleton's When the Steam Railroads Electrified, Michael Bazzilla's Electric Traction on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and Albert Chiarella's first volume of the Pennsylvania Railroad, along with piles of articles by historians like Jack Swanberg and many others. And of course, primary archival documents, some of which I'll share in a bit. And though my book came out in April, I'm very much still learning. I am neither an electrical engineer nor a railroader, but a reader and writer trying to give the corridor worthy cultural context. I wrote this book for everyone, rail fans, professionals, new urbanists, history buffs, but especially I wanted to tell its story to people who would not otherwise notice, people who have no idea what powers their commute and drives their day. Among the many things I learned while writing this book and preparing for this talk tonight is that while I left the seaboard, I remain very much plugged into the corridor's electrical heritage. Over a century ago, Buffalo, where I live, leveraged its proximity to hydropower projects at Niagara Falls to become what residents of the fin de siècle called the City of Light. Today, the Robert Moses power generating hydroelectric power station sends current across the Empire State, including to Metro New York. It was the Buffalo-Niagara frontier where Nikola Tesla's alternating current technology triumphed at the Pan American Exposition to the chagrin of Thomas Edison. I'm currently sitting in my house 5 blocks south of the former home of Alfred P. Southwick, inventor of the electric chair. I'm also 5 blocks west of the NFTA Metro Rail, which I frequently ride to work. The region even had an electrified freight railroad, the Niagara Junction Railway, which operated under 600-volt direct current wires until Conrail dieselized the operation in 1979. A few surviving GE units passed on to Metro North, where they were refurbished to operate on third rail and served as switchers in and around Grand Central Terminal. But this is not a story of Western New York. And so I want to step back in time and southeastern geography. We're going to pick up at the dawn of American electric traction in the state of New Jersey. Part 1, Edison. Metro Park is a white-collar enclave 24 track miles from Manhattan. The prefix Metro comes from Metroliner, an attempted bullet train that once served the station. Park means office park, a collection of jigsawed ponds, mulch islands, and solar atria hoisting the flags of Fortune 500 capital. Oops, sorry. Park also hints at the station's chief draw, which is parking. Daily parking, permit parking, overnight parking, alternate parking. When it opened in 1971, Metro Park parked 820 cars. Today, the station's multi-deck garage absorbs 3,000. So convenient is Metro Park's parking that Staten Islanders drive over the outer bridge to use it, some crossing state lines to commute from one New York borough to another. Metro Park is an example of what journalist Joel Garrow calls an edge city, a point on the urban or metropolitan perimeter where office workers look out at one another through panes of glass that mirror the sun in blue or silver or green or gold. Edge cities often feel imperviously modern, as if engineered to forget they had a past. But Metro Park has history in spades, if you know where to look. Most of the community belongs to Woodbridge Township, which has existed since 1669, when King Charles II claimed for England the land beneath today's corporate campus, the junior executive apartments, and about half the dosa joints lining Oak Tree Road's Little India. Redcoats trooped through Woodbridge on a King's Highway, now graced by dialysis labs and gas stations. George Washington slept here, at an inn behind the 7-Eleven. Among its stealth landmarks, Metro Park claims one of the most important sites in transit history. From the train station, cross Route 27. This busy strip of asphalt was once a segment of the original Lincoln Highway, the first transcontinental road. Before that, it was part of a British colonial turnpike, and before that, a Dutch fur traders route, and before that, a portion of the Lenape-Assunpink Trail. I've highlighted the trail here, where you can see that New Jersey's logistical skeleton was taking shape long before Europeans arrived. Anyway, back to Route 27. Turn right on Christie Street. The lane leads uphill through regal oaks and ship-shaped lawns. At Middlesex Avenue, a bed of marigolds and morning glories surrounds a wooden sign. The sign reports that in May 1880, on this precise patch of suburban earth, Thomas Edison released 75 amps of direct current through his experimental electric railway. The tracks ran 3 miles from Christie Street to Pumptown, a streamside shack at what is today the 15th hole of the Metuchen Golf and Country Club. The railway received power through wires affixed to steam generators inside Edison's lab. The motor, a cross between a lawnmower and a stairmaster, brushed current from the rail to its driving axle. It towed passengers aboard an awning car and a trolley car that workers facetiously nicknamed the Pullman. Edison challenged his creation with sharp grades, hairpin turns, and a splendidly pointless trestle. He packed the miniature train with riders and shrugged off wrecks with fits of laughter. Tourists learned about Edison's electro-magnetic railway in the pages of Scientific American and New York Graphic, and then made pilgrimages to Menlo Park. At the word go, the machine shot off like a bullet, recalled a New York Herald reporter. The riding was very enjoyable for the first 500 yards or so, when suddenly a most horrible curve was reached, round which the motor, with its car attached, spun at a rather uncomfortable gait. Less courageous visitors stood trackside. They watched the strange vehicle sweeping through the Jersey woods, while the Pennsylvania Railroad's locomotives belched coal plumes from the valley below. Inventors had dreamed of moving things with electricity ever since Danish chemist Hans Christian Ørsted spun a compass needle with charged wire in 1820. Steam power reigned supreme on 19th century American railroads, but the technology was reaching its limits. A locomotive could go only as fast as the vapor it produced. High velocities required mounds of coal, ponds of water, tenders, tanks, and boilers. All this weight sapped speed. By offboarding power generation, an electric railway did not need to lug around its fuel. Edison deduced that, quote, the more power our stationary engine gives, the more rapidly we could go. I could drive the car along at 180 miles an hour if I wanted to. Edison later scaled back this boast, which we, in a figure 180 miles an hour, we've not yet hit on the corridor. And he conceded that at 130 miles an hour, wheels of ordinary construction would, quote, fly apart by the operation of centrifugal force. But the point stood. Electric traction could achieve speeds that steam locomotives could not. Edison was not the first person to invent an electric train. In 1879, Werner von Siemens' elektrische locomotive carried visitors through the Berlin Industrial Exposition. 3 decades before that, Congress gave $20,000 to a shovel-bearded patent officer named Charles Grafton Page. They wanted him to find a general substitute for the dangerous agency of steam. In 1849, Page took his galvanic battery train for a test drive. The vehicle reached 19 miles an hour on the Baltimore and Ohio tracks. People waved handkerchiefs at the machine. Enslaved tobacco pickers, this was Maryland before emancipation, watched in utter astonishment as the 11-ton vehicle, quote, propelled by some invisible giant by which his silence was as impressive as his noisy predecessor. Page's glory evaporated when his ceramic battery cells ruptured and the train slowed. In desperation, he asked passengers to deboard and walk alongside the right-of-way until he could regain speed, which he could never do. Page cut off the test, and his car doddered back to Washington under a cloud of nitrous fumes. Electric traction found its first commercial success on streetcar systems. In 1888, Menlo Park alumnus Frank Sprague wired the Richmond Union Passenger Railway, the first tram to replace horse-drawn carriages. Electrified trolleys caught on across the Northeast, and wires soon canopied the major thoroughfares of every coastal city. Streetscapes once jammed with hack carts, jitneys, omnibuses, and their attending manure heaps, now plugged into a clean and nearly noiseless grid. The poet Oliver Wendell Holmes marveled at the mysterious power of electrified trolleys. He wrote that riders know that without hands or feet, without horses, without steam, so far as they can see, they are transported from place to place, and that there's nothing to account for it except the witch broomstick and the iron or copper cobweb which they see stretched above them. Railroads harnessed electricity, or large-scale heavy-duty railroads harnessed electricity first to power underground operations. In 1894, the B&O strung wire to the ceiling of Baltimore's smoke-choked Howard Street Tunnel. In England, the city and South London lined its tubes with strips of 500-volt third rail, which partly inspired the Pennsylvania Railroad to employ trackside direct current in its Manhattan improvements. This is, of course, Manhattan Transfer. I'm not going to talk much about the PRR's initial third rail operation or the New Haven's earliest forays into direct current propulsion, but these technically were the first attempts to wire the future corridor. For decades, electricity remained affixed to unventilated tunnels rather than a viable competitor to steam. Thomas Edison's own patent suggested that electric railways would best serve regions where the traffic was too light for ordinary steamways, or where the main bulk of traffic was limited in certain seasons. Basically, he envisioned electric traction as a kind of feeder system that Midwestern farmers could use to get their harvests to railheads where steam locomotive-driven trains would pick up and take the freight from there. It would take a tragedy for mainline electric railroading to catch on in the United States. And this tragedy came on a foggy Manhattan morning in 1902. Thick mist billowed off the harbor, draping tree branches and fire escapes. The fog enveloped the Pennsylvania Railroad's ferries puffing between Jersey City and DeBrassus Street. It dabbed the sandstone townhouses on Park Avenue and wafted down to the tracks beneath Park Avenue's pavement. These sunken rails formed the final approach to Grand Central Depot, terminus for the New York Central and New Haven. The New Haven entered Manhattan as a guest of the Central. A passing steam engine fumigated the rock cuts and brick tunnels every 45 seconds. It's kind of hard to imagine just how busy these cuts would have been in this period. And on this morning, this fog-coated morning in 1902, trains moved timidly through the paper-colored air. 52 miles away, a New Haven Express highballed out of Danbury, Connecticut. The express switched onto the shoreline at Norwalk and clipped along the gray bank of Long Island Sound. At New Rochelle, the train's last car received a stenographer, a florist, a salesman, a veterinary surgeon, an optician secretary, a stock trader, a carriage builder, and a teacher. The express rolled through Westchester and the Bronx, over the Harlem River, and into the Park Avenue cut. At 8:17 a.m., it received a stop signal 1,000 yards north of Grand Central. That same morning, another commuter-laden train chugged out of White Plains. Its engineer was 37-year-old John Whisker, whom colleagues characterized as sober but ambitious and impatient of delay. The stalled Danbury train caused a green caution semaphore to drop in front of Whisker at 63rd Street. He throttled past it without slowing. At 59th Street, a red stop blade fell. Whisker barreled forward nonetheless, unresponsive, as his firemen screamed the colors, green, green, red, red. Up ahead, the Danbury Express still sat motionless. New Haven flagman Frederick Barnum dropped from his train to the track bed and fastened a small dynamite charge to one of the rails behind the last car. The charge, called a torpedo, would alert an oncoming train that a train lay in its path. Barnum gazed through the ash. The pinprick of Whisker's headlight glimmered down the tracks. But which track? 9 pairs of rails, mazed together at 56th Street. Barnum watched the pinprick fatten into an oval, then sharpen into a silhouette. The silhouette ripped through the shroud, its pistons and drive shafts charging forward toward the Danbury Express. Barnum swung his lantern against the locomotive like champagne on a yacht's bow, but still it charged on. Then, the Danbury Express received a clear signal. The train rolled a few feet before the White Plains local caught it. Whisker's engine entered the express's last carriage like a missile. Its cylindrical boiler burst. White vapor scalded the New Rochelle commuters, all of whom were sitting in the last car. From their carriage came shrieks and groans and the sound of escaping steam like a whistling tea kettle. Survivors leapt from the geyserous wreck and crawled along a track bed littered with glass rags and chunks of seat cushion. They climbed to the street through escape patches with smoke-stung eyes and burned scalps and cracked ribs. 15 passengers died. Whisker, however, survived. He appeared in court, gaunt and trembling. His pale face seemed to hold the morning fog in it. Facing second-degree manslaughter charges, Whisker testified that tunnel smog smudged out the signal blades. The clamor kept him from hearing the torpedo, an emergency gong, and his firemen. He claimed that he had done his best, and the jury believed him. They blamed the Park Avenue wreck not on a fallible human, but on his employer's indefensible dependence on steam. Whisker walked free. The Albany legislature then drafted a bill banning coal engines from Manhattan. The bill's ratified version suggested that trains could run, quote, by electricity or by compressed air or by any mode of power other than steam. The New York Central complied by laying third rail similar to what British engineers installed in the London Underground. The Central's new, nearly emissionless electric trains did not require a hulking shed, so down came Grand Central Depot, and up sprung a new terminal, hewn from Indiana limestone and crowned by the Roman god Mercury carved in contrapposto. The station buried trains in its basement, but lifted passengers into the cosmos by scattering stars across the ticket hall's cerulean vault. From the fateful morning of January 1902 came the modern Grand Central Terminal. The New York Central's electrification compelled its guest, the New Haven, to figure out how to power its Manhattan trains. The simplest solution would have been to extend the Central's wirework up the Sound and out to Connecticut. But when the New Haven installed ground-level conductors on its Berlin-Hartford branch in 1897, neighbors protested the bristling bars, which menaced children and livestock. Some feared that the conductors discharged venomous fluid into the air, a fear that, as we'll see, would stick around for another century. A string of grisly electrocutions led the Connecticut Superior Court to outlaw third rail. The Manhattan steam ban and Connecticut third rail prohibition left the New Haven with two options. It could operate steam trains to the Harlem River, then ferry passengers into Grand Central on electric shuttles, or it could build an overhead power distribution system, then design new trains that worked both with suspended wires and the Central's third rail. Long maligned for its monopolistic overlords, the J.P. Morgans and Charles Sanger Mellons who fleeced passengers and stinted on capital improvements, the New Haven this time refused a cheap fix. It instead committed to what would become one of the country's greatest public works. The New Haven launched the first mainline electrification in American history. Part 2, to New Haven. There was so much more to electrifying the New Haven than just the salary, recalled William Spencer Murray, a Boston consulting engineer who gave up half his income to work for the railroad. Murray saw the shoreline's electrification as nothing short of holy work that would promote what he called the most potent factor in modern advancement and settle a schism over the imperceptible movement of subatomic particles, the war of the currents. For years, Edison's direct current technology dominated the field. But by 1890, the rival standard of alternating current had made inroads. Where DC power shunted electrons in a single direction around a loop, AC circuits sent electrons waving back and forth in the pattern of a sine wave. According to its proponents, who included former Edison employee Nicholas Tesla, railway brake innovator George Westinghouse, and Murray himself, AC conveyed more power over greater distance with less leakage than DC. AC's detractors, who famously included Edison, alleged that it posed a constant threat to users. Alternating current had scored a series of high-profile victories over its counterpart, culminating in the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition, brilliantly lit by AC. Edison continued to gripe against the upstart technology, but in time, even his General Electric company began marketing AC gear. The War of the Currents seemed all but over in 1902. That is, until the New York Central announced that its state-mandated system would receive direct current. This decision reignited debates over the safest and cheapest methods to propel trains, right at the same time that the New Haven was grappling with its electrification mandate. In what historians have called a fit of vast technological hubris, the New Haven chose to power its shoreline with alternating current conveyed through a wire strung above the tracks. Thus began the railroad's great experiment with catenary, a Latin word for the shape of a chain hanging between two fixed points. Catenary has existed long before, its idea existed long before railroads, let alone electrified ones. Its geometric form beguiled observers. Thomas Jefferson admired its perfect equilibrium. Victorian art critic and notable train skeptic John Ruskin called catenary one of the, quote, most beautifully gradated natural curves. The Catalan architect Antoni Gaudí incorporated catenary arches, that is, catenary curves flipped upside down, into Barcelona's Sagrada Familia Cathedral. As it happened, Gaudí died after being struck by an electric tram on his way to confession in June 1926. You can also find catenary designs in the dramatic main terminal of Eero Saarinen's design for Dulles International Airport. Of course, train wires are much straighter than this. William Spencer Murray knew that he needed his catenary to remain in true line and level. It could not droop sensuously or swing in the wind like trolley string looped over telephone poles. Electric trains required constant tension. Murray achieved this by raising steel bridges over every 100 yards of track. Each bridge gripped the electrical wires like the headstock of a guitar. The taut spans formed a tunnel of zigzagging steel that receded into the distance like one mirror turned on another. Here are some images from UConn's business and industry collections. For those interested in shoreline operations, this is an absurd treasure trove. I'm actually going to drop the link in to the chat right now, but I have my choice of hundreds, if not thousands, of images to share today. I think the New Haven catenary support structures might be one of the most iconic features of the Northeast Corridor landscape, or one of the most recognizable ones. Some residents who lived around the tracks complained that the right-angled girders spoiled the supple coast. Others saw the structure as a kind of land art installation, as something that had a kind of brutal form of beauty. Yale graduate and Olympic pole vaulter Alfred Carlton Gilbert claimed that the New Haven wire supports were what inspired him to invent the erector set. The New Haven's catenary received 11,000 volts of alternating current from a power plant on Greenwich's Studwell Point. a picturesque peninsula where John Wilkes Booth's brother, the stage actor Edwin, once owned a cottage. When it opened in 1907, the Coscob Power Station consolidated the discharge of hundreds of steam locomotives under one red tile roof. Coal arrived by barge on the Mianus River, was crushed to bits, then fed into boilers that spun a bank of turbo generators. Workers fussed over walls of gauges, valves, and wheels. They wore vests and ties in images that I've seen, even though the boiler room grew hot enough to melt shoes. The New Haven planted rhododendrons around the plant in a sad attempt to harmonize its Spanish Revival factory with the picturesque peninsula. Shoreline trains collected current through hinged rooftop pans or pantographs. Each pantograph skimmed along the catenary wires like sleigh ruts on snow, touching just enough to create a circuit, yet not so much to cause unnecessary drag. Here are some examples of relatively early pantograph designs. At Woodlawn Junction, engineers of inbound trains pushed a button to retract the pantograph and deploy a pickup shoe that clutched third rail, the kind of system it would need to reach Grand Central. Their motors now ran on direct current. Outbound trains made the opposite conversion, pulling up shoes and releasing pans to the New Haven's wire. With scarcely a dimming of coach lights, New Haven trains switched sides in the war of the currents. The first electric train arrived in Stamford in 1907, which you can see here, an event that the New York Times described as the beginning of the last stage of the greatest enterprise in electric railroading yet attempted. By 1914, the wires stretched to New Haven. Murray boasted that his catenary provided a cleaner and more reliable ride for the public and greater profits for their carrier. Electric motors contained fewer parts than steam locomotives, which meant they could clock more miles between maintenance. Electric trains accelerated faster than coal engines, which required the ponderous buildup of steam pressure. The new machines practically scooted. Electric traction let the New Haven pack more trains onto the same length of track, increasing capacity. In 1922, the railroad carried 16 million passengers. And yet, Murray observed, instituting electric service was not exactly laid over a bed of roses. The catenary that seemed so perfect on drafting paper was prone to kinking in Connecticut's salt air. Pantographs sparked. Frigid weather caused lightning arcs to pop from pans. Bending contact wires around embanked curves required months of trial and error before a suitable support system was devised, the triangles, so gracefully described by Jack Swanberg. Trackside residents continued to complain. They said that the high-tension AC wires caused static to crackle through their phone lines. Many considered the macrame of wires and trusses a blight. And for all its Spanish Mission gables and pink-flowered hedgerows, the Coscob plant showered Greenwich with soot and pumped fly ash onto Long Island Sound. The current that Murray called the most potent force in modern advancement dealt gruesome injuries to steam-era railroaders. In May 1907, an electrician slipping off his platform car instinctively grabbed hold of a feed wire, which caused his body to swell, quote, almost twice its natural size. 1 month later, a contact wire grazed the back of a brakeman working atop a boxcar. According to the New York Times, it burnt him to a crisp. The feet and the hands were gone. That October, engineer Charles Phillips accidentally touched the catenary, sending, quote, 12,000 volts through his body, 10,000 more than are used to put a murderer to death at Sing Sing prison. Somehow he survived. With the kind of cold apathy that people had long associated with New Haven president Charles Sanger Mellon, Murray attributed these injuries to carelessness or violation of instructions. He hoped that the future would be, quote, free from this most regrettable feature. Scorched bodies would not detract from his great experiment, or he believed from the incontestable triumph of alternating current on the modern shoreline. Part 3, Superpower. After toiling 15 years under the wires, Murray traveled to Colorado, where the snow-capped Rockies whetted his vantage on problems, quote, faced too closely in the daily routine. Alpine vistas known to coax romantic poetry from some tourists stirred in the engineer a prosaic hope for what he called the better use through orderly co-coordination of the great forces used in the electric utility field. The New Haven project confronted Murray with America's scattershot management of power. We've been working fast and building well, but not always in coordination, he lamented. This patchwork approach could no longer meet the country's growing appetite for energy, a gap exposed when World War I's industrial ramp-up sent blackouts rolling through the Midwest. In the glow of Purple Mountain's majesty, Murray envisioned large networks linking the country's coal mines, dams, and generating plants to power hungry customers. Local utilities would join super-regional circuits. U.S. Department of Interior Secretary Franklin Lane invited Murray to organize his thoughts in a report focusing on the North Atlantic seaboard, where heavy manufacturing created what he called a maximum demand for power. In 1921, Murray submitted 261 pages of prose, numbers, graphs, charts, and maps titled Professional Paper 123, or A Superpower System for the Region Between Boston and Washington. Murray's inventory found that the American Northeast relied on 315 separate utilities. He advised the federal government to integrate these siloed systems with the same zeal that the New Haven shareholder J.P. Morgan once used to conquer competitors. Nothing should stop this project, not municipal borders or gubernatorial edicts, not the profit motives of plant owners or what Murray derided as the, quote, un-American demands of organized labor. Superpower imagined the Northeast as a formal political entity, an electric free trade zone carved from the thickets of domestic wire. The superpower region stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Lehigh Valley anthracite fields. It centered on the New Haven and Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. Murray observed that transmission lines strung atop catenary towers could conduct surplus electricity to wherever it was needed. A right-of-way that conveyed train passengers and telegraph pulses could also distribute energy. Secretary of Commerce and licensed civil engineer Herbert Hoover commended Murray's plan, noting that, quote, no one has yet been able to kick a hole in it. Secretary Hoover established the Northeast Superpower Commission. Despite its technical elegance, superpower garnered little industry support. Local power suppliers feared federal regulation. The coal lobby worried that better transmission networks would reduce fossil fuel demand. When a Department of Interior study showed that electrifying railroad trunk lines would decrease coal consumption by 19 million tons a year, mine owners began to speak out against Murray. A chartered superpower corporation never materialized. Just as earlier attempts to integrate regions, including the internal improvement schemes of the 1820s and 1830s, fell apart, the same thing happened to superpower, leaving private companies to do what they would with the management of electricity in the Northeast. But in 1928, 9 years after Murray returned from the Colorado mountains like Moses laden with tablets, his ideas came back to life in a conference room cluttered with binders, blueprints, and line charts. Maps plastered the wainscoted walls. Multicolored pins stabbed through power plants, rail lines, neighborhoods, and factories. Whoever generated all this paper seemed acquainted with the future and authorized to shape it. But this room belonged to no planning authority, federal office, Wall Street suite, or conclave of superpower. It was the second floor of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Broad Street Station. With its exuberant Frank Furness-designed head house and vast iron-plated train shed, Broad Street Station loomed beside Philadelphia's City Hall, twin symbols of a powerful commonwealth and formidable carrier. With its murals, medallions, plaster reliefs, and fireplace tiles depicting scenes from Walter Scott novels, Broad Street extended the PRR's perpetual public relations campaign in stone. If the Wall Street-directed New Haven was something of a Gilded Age black sheep, the Pennsylvania Railroad basked in the glow of a favored sun. The Pennsylvania already operated electric trains in the New York metro area and along several commuter lines serving Philadelphia. Demographic projections now compelled these efforts to accelerate. Where the New Haven responded to legal mandates, the Pennsylvania answered demographics. It foresaw a day when its seaboard main line would serve 30 million passengers. In 1928, the railroad announced it would electrify its New York to Washington line, a project that historian Michael Bazilla has characterized as the largest capital improvement program ever undertaken by an American railroad. It is a new era of railroading, though the new will not supplant the old, but supplement and extend it, explained Pennsylvania Railroad President William Wallace Atterbury, a former brigadier general who built military railroads in France during the Great War. Like his gifted predecessors, Alexander Cassett, Samuel Rhee, and James McCree, Atterbury recognized that the PRR could either adapt or atrophy in the face of new competition. News of the electrification project broke 1 week after Newark Airport opened. As you can see here, you might not be able to see because the print's kind of small. The article ran beside advertisements for the Rio Motor Car Company, Saucony Special Gasoline, and the Capitol Bus Terminal, which invited readers to, quote, see America from an armchair. The PRR chose the same alternating current system that Murray pioneered on the New Haven. Rather than draw power from a dedicated plant, as the New Haven did at Cos Cob, the Pennsylvania purchased its supply from the Philadelphia Electric Company, which funneled the Susquehanna River through its 7-turbine Conowingo Dam. The dam sat 8 miles upstream from the PRR's still active, at least for now, mainline bridge, which meant that passengers could see out their windows the same mazy flow that powered their ride. Atterbury's railroad made way for wires through Herculean feats of civil engineering. A canal was raised in Trenton, a tunnel relined in Baltimore, and new stations erected in Philadelphia and Newark. The project proceeded with trademark Pennsylvanian inevitability. In March 1929, Atterbury predicted uniformly good times on a seaboard where industry hummed along at 95% capacity. But just a year later, Pennsylvania Railroad employees were not presiding over good times. They were chopping rail ties into firewood to warm the freezing residents of Elizabeth. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, Atterbury assured shareholders that electrification would proceed without any slackening, retrenchment, or postponement. He reminded investors that the PRR had weathered panics before, that its stock certificates commanded the respect of currency, and that its bonds found buyers everywhere from London to San Francisco. But as the Depression deepened, Atterbury watched equity markets tank. The railroad, in desperation, turned to now President Herbert Hoover the former superpower advocate who created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to brace America's wobbling economy. The PRR requested a $50 million RFC loan. The RFC offered the railroad $27 million at 6% interest. By the time New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt succeeded Hoover in 1933, the Pennsylvania had chosen to repay its RFC loan and pause electrification. During his first summer in office, Roosevelt expanded the RFC and created a new agency, the Public Works Administration, which summarized its mission in a leather-bound Keynesian parable titled America Builds. And I'm going to quote from the preface of this text. Quote, "Here was a country with a great and growing need for more schools, more highways, more bridges, more waterworks, more services of all kinds. Here was an army of men willing and able to build them. Here was an industry hungry for orders for the needed materials. The idea was to bring them all together. The job would have to be some time. Why not now?" The PWA poured most of its money into roads, but reserved $200 million to help railroads catch up, in its phrase. A $77 million infusion from the PWA helped the Pennsylvania string wires toward Washington. Originally conceived in Broad Street's palace of corporate sovereignty, the tax-funded power project wound up demonstrating the virtues of hothouse capitalism. The future corridor became a public work. Electrification generated 45 million labor hours for Depression-era workers. The project busied people beyond the tracks by stimulating the production of raw materials. The PRR converted 55 million pounds of copper into catenary, transformers, substations, and locomotives. 100,000 tons of steel became catenary bridges and the Passaic River Lift Bridge. By August 1934, the railroad had poured 6,650 tons of cement into catenary pole supports. Like a small-scale Tennessee Valley Authority, the PRR's electrification used what Murray had called the most potent force in modern advancement to galvanize an immiserated Northeast. Despite its uplifting imagery, the work remained as grueling and dangerous as ever. Rubber-gloved workers hung from guy wires. They strung copper in continuous shifts through sun and snow, risking their lives clamping high-voltage wires over tracks as steam engines blasted them with smoke from below. In 1933, the PRR distributed a booklet to workers in electrified territory that addressed topics like resuscitation from electric shock after apparent death, and included such insights as, quote, "Accidental electric shock does not always kill. It may only stun the victim and stop his breathing for a while." When the first electric train left Washington in 1935, Interior Secretary Harold Ickes claimed that the project demonstrates what actually has been accomplished under PWA when private initiative aids the administration in carrying out its reemployment plans. The PRR drew from the darkest depths of the Depression one of the country's most enduring acts of infrastructure. But in so doing, the railroad had, at least according to Ickes, been reduced to aid, auxiliary help to a federal design. Ickes seems to describe the Pennsylvania as something like a human resources contractor. He had relegated the railroad to a time when states chartered railways to serve their people. His remarks also foretold a future when war, recession, and demographic shifts would again blur the line between public and private interest. Part 4, a new motor. The Pennsylvania now sought a vehicle worthy of its wiring. The early days of electric railroading had produced what are, at least in my opinion, some truly ungainly machines. Engines stood stiffly upright with rods, springs, lamps, and handlebars jutting everywhere. Some sported cow catchers, even though the days of free-ranging northeastern cattle were long gone. The DD-1, a direct current workhorse built in 1910, resembled two cabins coupled together atop enormous wheels and jack shafts. The P5 of 1931 bore the stubby heft of a power plant. In search of something a bit more elegant, the Pennsylvania turned to a consortium that included Westinghouse, General Electric, and Gibbs Hill. Westinghouse had recently launched its art and engineering division under the direction of Donald Donner, an Indianan with a trapezoidal mustache and wireframe glasses. Donner studied landscape painting at the Art Institute of Chicago, and as I learned from Donald Waite's informative articles, later developed the world's first industrial design curriculum for the Carnegie Institute of Technology. At Westinghouse, Donner designed everything from plastic vacuum cleaners to micarta serving trays to locomotives. He began the PRR motor job with a knife and gypsum lump and proceeded to peel strand upon strand of plaster to reach the engine he saw inside. Donner was, in the most literal sense, streamlining, a word that signified both the reduction of an object's wind resistance and a poetics of simplification. His finished mold was a feat of aerodynamic optimization and exquisite art. Westinghouse and General Electric converted Donner's gypsum mold into a full-size prototype at the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Eddystone, Pennsylvania. The builders struggled to match Donner's supple knife work with bolts and shells. The prototype performed beautifully in tests nonetheless. It mustered 8,500 horsepower, necessary for freight, and topped 100 miles per hour, vital for passengers. The Pennsylvania ordered 139 of the engines to be manufactured at General Electric's Erie plant and the railroad's own shops in Altoona. They classified the new motor GG1. 1 week before the engine entered production, the PRR paid an external consultant $5,000 to enhance the GG1's aesthetics. The consultant was a Parisian combat veteran who inhaled mustard gas at the Battle of Reims and later dressed windows for Macy's. As a teenager, Raymond Loewy designed rubber band airplanes. At 24, he lost both parents to the 1918 global influenza outbreak. He claimed his first kiss possessed, quote, helicoidal characteristics with accelerating progression in depth and tasted like Parma violets in April. When conscripted in the French army, Loewy furnished his trench with floral wallpaper, drapes, and tufted pillows. If life were a Wes Anderson film, he would be played by Ralph Fiennes, at least I think. Loewy haunted railroads and rail yards throughout his adolescence, lamenting that, quote, my irresistible craving to sketch and dream locomotives led to my complete oblivion as a dancing partner. Upon immigrating to New York, Loewy made it his goal to work for the standard railroad of the world. The flamboyantly individualistic Parisian may have seemed like a poor fit with the PRR's starchy corporatism, but he shared with the railroad's great war veteran president a faith in progress through innovation. The persistent Frenchman received his first commission to redesign station trash cans. Impressed by the receptacles, Pennsylvania executives showed Loewy photographs of the GG1 prototype. It had a disconnected look, Loewy recalled. Component parts did not seem to blend together, and its steel shell was a patchwork of riveted sections. It looked unfinished and clumsy. Loewy proposed replacing the rivets with a welded body, restoring the smooth surface that Donner had cut from clay. While conventional wisdom long credited Loewy with inventing the GG1's aesthetic, recent research by Waite and others suggests that his genius was figuring out how to incorporate those elements into a full-size machine. Loewy did suggest the Brunswick green paint scheme accented by 5 golden pinstripes, a curvilinear flourish that tied the whole composition together. Loewy traveled to the Pennsylvania car shops at Wilmington, climbed a ladder, flung off his overcoat, and began marking up the prototype with tape and chalk. I could feel that my audience was convinced, he remembered. The corrections were obvious. The corrections were obvious improvements, and all realized that I knew what I was doing. The GG1 became an instant Art Deco icon, lithe, sensuous, perfected. Its streamlined body symbolized a metropolitan Northeast in postage stamps, paintings, and photographs set against the Manhattan skyline, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Washington Capitol. The GG1 cameoed in Hollywood films, including Broadway Limited, Bright Victory, Blast of Silence, and the original Manchurian Candidate. It towed kings, actors, ball clubs, and presidents, both campaigning, sitting, retired, and dead. On July 8, 1968, 2 Penn Central GG1s carried the funeral train of slain presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy. Loewy would receive most of the acclaim. By the time GG1s swept along the corridor, Westinghouse had fired Donner after learning that his art and engineering division spent over $75,000 a year. Donner taught at Brooklyn's Pratt Institute until he died of carbon monoxide poisoning on Christmas Eve, 1943. Donner's death left Loewy the GG1's exclusive spokesman, poet, and theorist, a role he parlayed into a $20,000 annual consulting contract with the Pennsylvania and eventual pop stardom. Loewy would apply the GG1's fluid contours to Coke bottles, Studebakers, KitchenAid mixers, Le Creuset saucepans, and NASA's Skylab. This is the title page of Loewy's book, The Locomotive, Its Aesthetics. I find Loewy endlessly fascinating, and I wish he were still alive to redesign our kitchen. An equally prolific graphic artist, Loewy sketched the logos for the Coast Guard, the Postal Service, Exxon, and Shell Petroleum. In 1962, he watched a, quote, rather gaudy orange military plane carrying John F. Kennedy into Palm Springs and pictured in his mind the ultramarine livery that graces Air Force One today. The electrification project that sped corridor trains and returned Depression-era Northeasterners to work also launched one of the greatest design careers in history. I will add that Donald Donner did not fade entirely into the past. The Lippincott and Margulies firm that he co-founded in 1943 would go on to generate its own iconic images for Eastern Airlines, American Express, Chrysler, and Pizza Hut. In 1971, the Lippincott orchestrated the rebranding of the National Rail Passenger Corporation as Amtrak. Part 5, No Land for Bullet Trains. By mid-century, the electrified lines of the Pennsylvania and New Haven were no longer a cutting-edge marvel. They had been eclipsed. In October 1964, Japanese National Railways christened its Tokaido Shinkansen high-speed line. Americans tuning into the Tokyo Summer Olympics saw bubble-nosed trains whoosh past Mount Fuji at the astounding speed of 130 miles per hour. These trains flew over welded rail fastened to concrete ties on a route free from the freight and commuter traffic that clogged U.S. tracks. The fast, sleek, and impeccably timely bullet train came as a revelation to Americans. a zero-altitude Sputnik moment that coincided with President Lyndon Johnson's reconception of transit as a tool for urban renewal. In 1965, the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act authorized the Secretary of Commerce to research new materials, aerodynamics, vehicle propulsion, vehicle control, communications, and guideways. With the stroke of one of his Parker Eversharp felt pens, Johnson transformed the corridor into a laboratory. These are the pens that Johnson used to sign some of the signature laws from his Great Society programs. While writing this book, I realized the degree to which the corridor's history is just constantly tied up with federal legislative programs, the New Deal, the Great Society, the American system of the early 1800s, Reaganomics, Bidenomics, though it would never become a pure state-run operation like Japan's Shinkansen. In 1965, railcar builders and aerospace firms submitted designs to the Department of Commerce. Here are some of the ones that I came across while conducting research at the Hagley Library. This sketch comes courtesy of the St. Louis Car Company. Here is one from the Budd Company. I think of all of these, we could think of them as unbuilt metro liners. The jauntiest came from the Pullman, Standard Pullman Company. This to me still looks a bit futuristic, even 60 years later. And here is another one from Budd, which to my eye looks a good bit like the cars they would eventually build for Patco high-speed service between Philadelphia and South Jersey. In preparation for high-speed testing, the Pennsylvania upgraded a section of track in central New Jersey and re-geared a Pioneer 3 electric multiple unit car. There are some things we don't know, said project manager J. Roland Smith. We've never run a train at 150 miles an hour. The first prototype of all the different plans that the Department of Commerce received, the first to actually get built, looked like a scruffy Shinkansen cousin. Engineered by the United Aircraft Company, the turbo train featured an aluminum fuselage, egg-shaped docking nose, and sloping dome cars. The seductive adjective turbo, from the Latin word for tornado, described the engine's cyclonic motion. A mixture of gasoline and compressed air entered each 400 horsepower turbine. The fuel's combustion spun a rotor, which twirled a shaft, which turned the locomotive's gears. On December 20th, 1967, a test turbo train gusted through Princeton Junction at 170.8 miles per hour, setting a North American rail speed record that still stands in 2024. I find it ironic that the fastest train in corridor history made no use of its catenary. The second high-speed prototype resembled a stainless steel pipe. Its self-powered carriages coupled together like the cars of a subway train. Each car pair sprouted a pantograph. Where the GG1 offered Art Deco elegance and the turbo train promised space-age ground flight, this locomotiveless column looked intentionally austere. The Pennsylvania hired marketing icon Al Paul Lefton to devise a suitably postmodern brand. Lefton tossed out some sedate monikers, Speedliner, Railblazer, before settling on a portmanteau that welded the train to its region, Metroliner. The Metroliner impressed early observers. One set of multiple unit cars clocked 164 miles per hour outside New Brunswick in November 1967. Though a notch slower than the turbo's top speed, this was no stunt. The Metroliner would carry real passengers over these same tracks. A bullet train seemed at least conceptually possible under the wires between New York and Washington. It became more feasible when the Pennsylvania, and then its successor, the Penn Central, made some efforts to upgrade the line. Track gangs replaced bolted rails with welded ones, and copper catenary with cadmium bronze wire. They sealed off grade crossings and built new suburban park and ride stations at Island, New Jersey, Metro Park, and Lanham, Maryland, Capital Beltway, later replaced by New Carrollton. While Japan's Shinkansen required a dedicated right-of-way, the Pennsylvania claimed its Metroliner could work on a lightly rehabbed corridor. Neither Philadelphia's sweeping Frankfurt curve, nor Baltimore's twisting tunnels, nor the presence of lumbering freights and skittering commuter trains would discourage them. Penn Central CEO Stuart Saunders went so far as to spin this patchwork approach as a kind of accomplishment. He bragged that the Metroliner's 32-month incubation period was, quote, considerably shorter than the 7 years of research, development, and testing which the Japanese required to initiate their Tokaido high-speed line. As with the GG1, the Metroliner project was undertaken by a consortium. Philadelphia's Budd Company manufactured the train's distinctive columnar car bodies. General Electric and Westinghouse supplied electrical components. This partnership, as I'm sure many of you know, very quickly frayed. Budd technicians could not make the Westinghouse parts work. Air compressor coils rattled. Coaches wobbled on turns. Metroliners drew so much current from the New Deal era catenary system that they burned out substations like appliances overloading a circuit. The carriages rose and fell on the rough track bed like merry-go-round horses. Metroliners sometimes vacuumed up ballast stones and occasionally sucked windows from adjacent trains. As testing schedules lapsed, engineers and officials pointed fingers at one another. Their frustration pours out in crinkling mimeographs, telephone transcripts, committee memos, and marginal jottings, boxes upon boxes of frustration stored at the Hagley Library in Wilmington, Delaware. To pluck out one document among thousands, this is from the papers of Lewis T. Clowder Associates. It shows just how often the Metroliners, individual Metroliner train sets were out of service for a single week in 1969. While working at the Hagley, I also came across a manila folder of documents pertaining to one federal official's less than helpful suggestion that Metroliners include seat belts. This obliged the railroad to necessitate what one note called a very brief study. Another sheet recounts a particularly star-crossed run from 1969 when a Westinghouse Metroliner repeatedly lost power. The windshield wiper blades would not even sit flush on the windshield. In reading through this story, I just can't help but think of everything that Avelia, the next generation Acela Express, is going through right now. Its trials and tribulations have been meticulously documented in media, on rail message boards. I wonder what the growing pains of older technologies tell us about what's happening now and what it is we should be asking of our officials and of the quasi-private corporation Amtrak that's in charge of the project. By the time dignitaries gathered at Union Station for the Metroliner's inaugural run, the Great Society was over. Backlash to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 cost Democrats most of their House majority. Lyndon Johnson dropped out of the 1968 Democratic primary. His figural war on poverty had been eclipsed by the literal war he escalated in Vietnam. The president did not attend the Metroliner's send-off, but the morning's keynote address from incoming Secretary of Transportation John Volpe savored of Great Society optimism. This is Volpe. Volpe was the second Secretary of Transportation. When the Metroliner project began, there was no Department of Transportation. It was still the Department of Commerce. Here's what Volpe said at the Metroliner inaugural launch. I want to say to the people of Washington and New York and all points in between, the Metroliner is your train. Use it. Tickets are ready. Here's some more scenes from the launch that were published in the March 1969 issue of the Penn Central Post. This is Volpe at the podium, Nixon's Secretary of Transportation, and I'm pretty sure that's Stuart Saunders to his almost immediate right. Here, the Metroliner arrives at Wilmington. It's blasting through a banner, and you can see quite visibly the faded Keystone logo in the lower right below the number. Just as there was no Department of Transportation when the high-speed ground transportation project got off the ground, there was no Penn Central. The Penn Central took over the project in the middle. Here is a young Senator, Claiborne Pell, longtime high-speed rail advocate who was instrumental in urging first John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson to invest in this project. I'm told that in the final years of his life, the Rhode Island senator got to see an Acela Express fly under the wires through Kingston. If you read a lot of the early reviews of Metroliner service in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the emphasis is not on the technology or the railroad operations, it's on the service that people received aboard cars. Here, from left to right, are Miriam Modem, Barbara Tull, and Mary Lee Hawley, who were rank and file employees of the Penn Central, who served in a role that the railroad called Metro Misses for the day, a kind of ambassador role where they explained how the trains function. This strikes me as a nod to the much glamorized role of flight attendants in the 1960s. Oh, and thank you for the comment, John Volpe. I I appreciate that. Years later, obviously, when it was obvious that the Metroliners were not working as they were hoped to, a federal official lamented, quote, "If we had to do it over again, we would have gone much more carefully." Metroliners were too finicky for the corridor. Amtrak eventually banished them to Harrisburg service, where they cut an absurd figure, rolling past red barns and horse buggies in Amish Lancaster. Though propulsion problems ultimately sunk the Metroliner concept, passengers liked its coach design, which of course inspired the Amfleets, the oldest of which will celebrate their 50th birthday next year. But before Amfleet, some Metroliners survived in inanimate form, plucked of their pantographs and towed by conventional engines. Depowered Metroliners even sometimes appeared behind GG1s, which were now soldering into their 5th decade of service. Part 6, improvements. The line from Boston to Washington, now called the Northeast Corridor, underwent extensive renovations in the 1970s and 80s. Under the auspices of the Northeast Corridor Improvement Program, President Gerald Ford signed into law a multi-billion-dollar slate of improvements. NECIP projects included new stations for the Connecticut Edge City of Stamford and the Baltimore-Washington International Airport. Crews cleared underbrush, abandoned automobiles, household appliances, and garbage from the right-of-way. Painters slapped fresh coats on rusting bridges over the Thames, Connecticut, Hutchinson rivers. Mechanics automated Maryland's Bush River drawbridge. Workers fenced off crossings, dug drainage ditches, and of course replaced catenary. A bright orange work train nicknamed the Monster spooled out miles of welded rail and replaced wooden ties with concrete ones. The NECIP contended with delays and overruns. Contractors accused one another of incompetence. The FBI investigated corrupt procurement procedures. At one point, an exasperated Brock Adams, Secretary of Transportation, vowed that track work would proceed even if I have to go outside myself with a pick and shovel. Month by month, the program nudged the corridor into better working order. Having abandoned their bullet train fantasies, officials set a more reasonable goal of running trains between New York and Washington in under 3 hours. This benchmark required new equipment to replace GG1s long past their useful economic life and glitchy metroliners, which had never been economical at all. Unfortunately for Amtrak, this acquisition coincided with an era of de-electrification, during which freight carriers like the Milwaukee Road and Great Northern snipped their wires and purchased diesel engines. Diesels generated their own electricity, which meant, of course, they did not require catenary. But like the steam engines that Thomas Edison dreamed of replacing, they also lacked the speed and efficiency of electric motors tapping external power sources. Freight carrier dieselization caused manufacturers to exit the electric motor market, which left Amtrak with few options. In 1972, the railroad acquired a souped-up electric freight engine from General Electric. The loaf-shaped E60 weighed roughly 30% more than the GG1 and lacked its graceful contours. In trials, the E60's wheels hunted, that is, pitched from side to side on acceleration, inflicting lateral stress on the corridor's new welded rails. When an E60 clonked off the tracks during acceptance testing, the Federal Railroad Administration capped its speed at 85 miles per hour, too slow to keep a Metroliner schedule. Amtrak eventually decided to cut bait by selling the E60s off to New Jersey Transit and New Mexico's Navajo Mine Railroad, where the engines returned to the freight work for which they were best suited. A more worthy replacement for the GG1 arrived in 1978, not from Budd, Westinghouse, or General Electric, but from Sweden via General Motors Electromotive Division plant in LaGrange, Illinois, to be precise. The robotics manufacturer Allmänna Svenska Elektriska Aktieboladets stubby AEM7 resembled nothing that had ever crossed corridor rails. The engine's electrical components spilled out of its roof in a cascade of transformers, coils, hatches, and discharge outlets. Where American designers hid function behind streamlined shrouds and stainless steel shells, the AEM7 anticipated industrial chic decor by baring its machinery. The Swedish toasters, as many people called them, paired perfectly with the corridor's improving but still imperfect track. Though almost 18 feet shorter than a GG1, the AEM7 packed enough power to pull 8 cars at 125 miles per hour. An Amtrak test driver said that he had to dog it to avoid speeding. Some criticized Amtrak for importing foreign trains to the standard railroad of the world. Others noted that the 3-hour run times from New York to Washington were a far cry from Great Society-era promises of rocket trains and hovercraft. No AEM7 would come close to touching the 170.8 mile per hour record set by the turbo train in 1967. But that didn't seem to matter. A new spirit of pragmatism reigned on the corridor. The AEM7 did not need to compete with bullet trains, fulfill social mandates, or otherwise vindicate some belabored idea of Americanness. Like the era's other iconically sensible Swedish import, the Volvo, the AEM7 could carry passengers reliably through the Northeast, and for a time that would be enough. It's a testament to the AEM7 that they're still kicking around. Imagine my surprise in January 2023 while attending an academic conference in San Francisco. I went for a morning run near Mission Bay and spotted this toaster a long way from home, but alive nonetheless. Caltrain acquired, I think, 2 of them to test its new electrification system. Though despite all my searches, I have not been able to figure out whether 938 here has been involved in the testing or what it's done. I haven't seen any video or photographic evidence of that. Maybe some of you know more than I. Amtrak retired its last GG1 in 1980. The same year, the locomotive's artistic consultant, 87-year-old Raymond Loewy, retired to Monaco. A few holdout GG1s continued to prowl New Jersey Transit's North Coast line until 1983, when all surviving numbers were scrapped, parked in museums, or left rusting on spurs. Specimens of the engine survive in rather random settings: museums in Dallas, Green Bay, Baltimore, and St. Louis, the woods outside Cooperstown, an exhibit in Elkhart, Indiana, a track beside the New York State Fairgrounds in Syracuse. Only one GG1, number 4859, the official state locomotive of Pennsylvania, rests beneath wires. Part 7, finishing the job. In the late 1980s, Amtrak turned its attention to the corridor's most glaring drawback: the 157 miles of unelectrified track between New Haven and Boston. Plans to string catenary to Boston languished for over half a century, rendering this segment a sort of second-class annex. Boston-bound passengers felt this demotion at New Haven, where they paused while crews replaced electric engines with diesel locomotives. This schedule suggests that the locomotive swap took as few as 9 minutes, but to my memory, it always seemed more like 15 or 20. Either way, when the coach lights clicked back on, these trains, under diesel power, lumbered off toward Massachusetts at an average pace of 56 miles per hour. They're two different railroads, explained Amtrak's David Carroll at the time. South of New York, you have the rail line with homes nearby, but you don't have grade crossings, and you don't have beautiful scenery and the shorelines that you have here. In southeastern Connecticut, we are literally in people's backyards. Indeed, the corridor's easternmost appendage bore little resemblance to the New Haven Railroad's commuter conveyor belt or the Pennsylvania's traffic-free steel boulevard. East of New Haven, the line usually had 2 tracks instead of 4. Those tracks seemed to bend around every boulder and pebbled cove. Their slower, less frequent trains scarcely disturbed the seaside ambience. But now, with passenger rail foe Ronald Reagan retired from the presidency to his California ranch, Amtrak planned to unite the corridor's different railroads with one continuous band of alternating current. They specifically saw their chance to sell the project to Reagan's former vice president and White House successor, George H.W. Bush. 5 days before he lost re-election, the train-loving Connecticut native signed the Amtrak Authorization and Development Act, releasing $1.27 billion to establish dependable passenger rail between Boston and New York in 3 hours or less. Opposition flared along the shoreline. The electrification project's environmental impact statement received 828 pages of public comment. Trackside residents complained that catenary would spoil coastal vistas. Environmentalists pondered the harm posed to nesting osprey and short-nosed sturgeon. A tennis club worried that increased train traffic would force members to, quote, stop play more frequently. Some claimed the new trains would be too loud. Others feared that the silence of electric engines posed a greater threat. A few people revived the old panic that high-voltage wires emit cancer-causing electromagnetic fields, the same kind of complaint that the New Haven Railroad faced in 1898. A group calling itself Citizens Against the Amtrak Electrification Project, this is their letterhead here, argued that the venture, quote, doesn't help southeastern Connecticut. New Yorkers and Bostonians benefit, not people along the southeastern coast. When Amtrak announced that it would add 33 trains a day to the electrified line, the fight centered around movable bridges. Upstream marinas needed these spans open so that sailboats and fishing charters could enter Long Island Sound. More trains presumably meant fewer openings. A Niantic boatyard owner urged the Department of Transportation, quote, our coastline is the most valuable asset Connecticut has. Please do not destroy this asset by eliminating access to the Long Island Sound and some of the best recreational and fishing waters in the world. Amtrak Connecticut and the Coast Guard finally hammered out an agreement. By installing more sensitive signals, Amtrak could scale up train frequency while keeping the inlets open to boat traffic 40 minutes per hour between 5 a.m. and midnight. Amtrak received its final environmental permit and construction began. Under this initial agreement, the continent's busiest railroad would contain saltwater gaps for a large part of the waking day. The electrification project broke ground in July 1996. Crews planted 15,000 catenary poles in New England's ancient volcanic coast. I struggled to find images of this construction, but here, this is from Hammer and Bit Corporation. This was just on a kind of corporate industry-facing page, just showing how good the hammers were to break through the granite mounds here. In some places, the New England's granite subsurface required jackhammers. Elsewhere, vacuums sucked up marsh muck before concrete foundations could be poured. It was a really challenging landscape. In Boston, workers wove their silver copper wire through the rebar chaos of another mega project, the Big Dig. Construction of the new I-93 tunnel made the corridor tracks sink. Nothing came easy. But when the new millennium dawned over Massachusetts, the corridor's freshest catenary buzzed with current. On January 28, 2000, an Amtrak mail train pulled into Boston's South Station behind an AEM 7. Passenger service began 3 days later with an electrification celebration special, which departed South Station, then abruptly tripped a breaker. The train slowed and the carriage lights dimmed. After a long moment, the lights blinked on and the engine regained speed to the immense relief of Amtrak officials and riding dignitaries. I take this anecdote from a New York Times article, though I also take it with a grain of salt because the reporter was Jason Blair, who you may remember from decades ago, resigned from the paper for fabricating basically most of his stories. The special, at least as far as I know from this article, swept south across Massachusetts and slipped through the tunnels under Providence. It banked through Stonington, Mystic, Groton, Old Saybrook, and several other seaside towns that fought electrification. The special paused in Penn Station before streaking across the toxic drownings of the Meadowlands, past the ceramic dotted row homes of Newark's Ironbound, through the deer-filled woods north of Trenton, along the brown peaks of Delaware Bay, and over the powerful and power-generating Susquehanna River. The corridor was now what Amtrak President George Warrington called a powerhouse of an engine that will help power the economy of a region. Amtrak's largest investment in its greatest asset had drawn Boston back into the main line of Northeastern life. Electrification also laid the groundwork for the corridor's third century, which opened with the age of Acela. We can talk about the gray train with blue accents that has inspired and frustrated Northeastern commuters for nearly a quarter century. We can talk about how Acela turned John Winthrop's city on a hill, Boston, into a true corridor terminus, how the train partly fulfilled the ambitions of Johnson-era visionaries, but how it also contributed to the economic stratification of Northeastern travel. In a word, how the Northeast Corridor, for better and worse, became an Acela corridor. But for now, I want to close by returning to the infrastructure behind that train. Part 8, Power Down. Once newfangled, electric traction has grown old enough to leave ruin. Vines wrap around catenary poles. Rusted signs from the 1920s scream, "Danger, live wire, 11,000 volts." The New Haven's Coscob Power Station closed in 1986 after decades of violating federal air quality laws. While rail fans usually associate the middle 20th century with steam power's last stand, electric trains continued to collect steam-generated current until 1979, when engineers replaced Koskob's turbines with oil burners. The flower-girded plant was one of the few places where corridor infrastructure disturbed the lives of affluent Northeasterners, a predicament encapsulated by a Greenwich resident who sent her white poodle into the yard each morning and, according to her interview in the New York Times, got a black one back each night. A playground now sits atop the corridor's first source of alternating current. An AstroTurf soccer field offers beautiful views of the harbor and of corridor trains whipping over the river. Thomas Edison closed his Menlo Park laboratory in 1987 to open a larger campus in West Orange. The woods reclaimed his electrical railway. Today, it's nearly impossible to trace the line. But I tried to do this on a warm afternoon in October 2022 and ultimately came up empty. I saw nothing except maybe a telltale gap between old-growth trees, a sidewalk claiming the old track bed, an orphaned gully, and the historical placard on Christie Avenue explaining what once was. Tract housing has buried Edison's experiment. On a late fall afternoon, crickets chirp, birds call, mowers drone, and the Garden State Parkway murmurs in the distance. The oak leaves are just starting to brown. And down in the valley, every few minutes, an electric train whispers through Metro Park. Thank you. And if you'd like to learn more, I can drop some links in the chat for places where you can acquire the book. But again, thank you all so much for coming out and listening to me talk for an hour and a half.